Welcome back to another episode of the React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by Twitter Rebrands. Because if it ain't broke, give it a shot and try and fix it anyway. Episode 272, Real Life React Native with Nick Alekhine from NTWRK.
Hey everybody, I'm Jamon, and this is a new series on React Native Radio called Real Life React Native. This is a series where we're going to interview developers who work on real life React Native apps. I mean, people who actually have users, people who are actually shipping React Native apps to production and not just sort of theoretical stuff. This is going to be actual real world stuff, which is kind of fun. They should be a little quicker, a little bit more kind of rapid fire, a little more just kind of high energy. So let's get started. Today, I'm sitting down with Nick Alekhine, a staff software engineer at NTWRK, who leads their mobile app development. Nick gave a talk at Chain React, our conference. Go check that out in the episode description. Thanks for coming on, Nick. First, I want to ask you, how was it giving your very first conference talk?
Leading up to it, it was pretty intimidating, but as soon as I got on stage, it felt really comfortable, pretty easy. Your team made it feel really casual, really fun, smooth. I felt really good coming out of that talk, and the reception was great. Yeah, I feel like I definitely want to do another one for sure.
It was a great talk, and I do recommend people go take a look at it. It's in the episode description, as I mentioned. And I just sort of have to relate it back to my first time attending a conference. I'd never been to a conference before. Had you been to a conference before that?
Not to this level, no.
Okay. So it was similar to me, where I'd been to some meetups and stuff, but I had, and maybe some bigger meetups, but not like a full-fledged conference. And then I was the very first speaker.
Wow.
At this conference, and I'd never given a talk before. So, but once I got on the stage, it was a topic I knew really well. And so I gave the talk and it went great. And actually, that's where I met my current business partners. That was nearly 10 years ago.
Wow.
So we're going to be talking about NTWRK and the work you're doing over there. Of course, it's spelled NTWRK because I assume because when you're a startup, at first you can't buy a vowel, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to give you some questions here. First off, what's the elevator pitch for NTWRK?
So NTWRK's a curated marketplace powered by live stream shopping. I like to think of it as the next generation of online shopping. So you think about the user experience of e-commerce. It really hasn't changed much in the past couple decades. It's primarily just been an image, some text, and a purchase button. But think about everything else that's taken place on the internet since then. Video has become a huge component of the online experience. You've got apps like Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, a bunch of others. And we're basically taking that basic commerce experience and enriching it with live video, community engagement features, and so on. To give some context, the Chinese market has a pretty evolved ecosystem of apps that do live commerce. And this started taking place out there in the mid to late 2010s. So there's apps like Taobao Live that are dominating out there, and the numbers they're doing are huge. To give a dollar figure to that, the market size for live commerce in China is on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars.
Wow.
It's really big. It's crazy big. I was really surprised when I first joined this company. But in the Western market, that number is a lot smaller. I've seen stats thrown around that the US market for live commerce will reach somewhere around $30 billion by the end of this year. So it's an order of magnitude smaller in the US. So it's the early days. People are really trying to figure it out, and we're giving a shot at it.
I really, actually, I kind of love it. Like when I looked at your app and I saw, someone on there interacting with people live. He's got video going, he's got chat going, he's got emotes kind of like floating through his screen. It was a cool experience seeing how that all worked. And I saw that, of course, in your talk as well. So let's get right to the meat of things. When did you start using React Native, and like how'd you get to that decision?
Sure. So I started dabbling around with it in 2018, but I didn't start building a production app with real users until the end of 2019 when I joined NTWRK. Before that, I was doing full stack web development, primarily React and TypeScript, Node.js backends. And I wanted to see how that technology would cross over into native mobile. I mean, I had heard about React Native kind of percolating at that time, and I wanted to see how it worked. Web developers have an incredible ecosystem of tools and packages to quickly build out these rich user experiences. And, we have that ability to deploy it to everyone immediately. And native apps just don't have that. They're kind of walled off gardens, right? Apple has their own ecosystem. Google has their own. There's no way to write once and deploy everywhere. And that's the vision that React Native had.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of a common story. And of course, everyone wants to know, what's your architecture stack? Like, what are you using under the hood?
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to go full stack or just in the mobile app itself?
Mainly React Native. That's what we're looking for on this podcast. Although, obviously it's maybe high level on the back end.
Sure. Yeah, I'll focus on the mobile app. So in terms of our networking layer, we're using GraphQL. That's kind of our main communication layer with our backend. We've got some REST endpoints. We kind of started off with that and then migrated over to GraphQL. We've got a raw WebSocket connection to handle some real-time updates. Then we started migrating over to a separate provider called Pusher that also does WebSockets. For live streaming, we're using WebRTC. We're using a third party for that called Agora. Outside of that, for the in-app routing, we're using React Navigation. For all the animation elements, we're using React Native Reanimated. We're using Datadog as well for usage metrics and error tracking. Stripe for payments. And what else?
TypeScript, of course.
TypeScript, of course. Yeah. TypeScript and React Native, that's the base. And then we've got a few other client applications that are web-based. So we've got the main mobile app that's targeting iOS and Android. That's a single repo. Then we've got kind of a back-of-house application that we've built. That's React and Next.js. And then we've got a consumer-facing web app. That's actually using React Native Web and Next.js. So we've ported over some of the components from the mobile app to that web app. And they're kind of a parallel experience, but not exactly the same. So we decided to make it two separate repos.
Yeah, that's always kind of a big decision point when you're talking about sharing code between native and web. What sort of things have you run into while you're developing this? Like any particular, for your particular application, any unique challenges? Like I know you're doing live video and you're doing a lot of like high velocity, reactions are happening and whatnot. Like anything with React Native specifically that have been some unique challenges?
Sure. I think at the time when I started, the ecosystem wasn't that evolved. There just weren't that many packages. So one thing we were doing was in-app payments. At the time that we started working on this project, Stripe didn't have an official payments package for React Native. So we had to use kind of this poorly maintained community package that had a pretty rough API. And that was a real thorn in our side. We thought we'd have to write native bindings for that. So we were kind of suffering with that for a while. And then Stripe finally came out with their own package. Live streaming was kind of a challenge, but we got really lucky. Agora, our provider, came out with a React Native package and we were able to just slot it in immediately. Other things, for a while, like the video packages in the ecosystem weren't that great, but Expo came out with a really good one called Expo AV. We just tooled up onto that maybe 2 weeks ago. Before that, we were using React Native Video, and that was working out for playing HLS streams and MP4 files, but we noticed with some of the latest builds we were on, some alpha build that was causing a ton of Android crashes, and we were like, oh man, this is rough. I mean, video is such a core part of the app experience, and for this to be causing pretty high crash rates for our users is rough. So we've just gotten really lucky that the community has been solving a lot of the problems that we've been chasing with our product. There's almost very little native code that we've had to write. So yeah, it's that has really taken me by surprise.
Don't you love it when Expo puts out a package? Because it's just going to be well designed and well maintained. It's fantastic.
Oh yeah, and the documentation is excellent. So good.
Absolutely. Kudos to Expo. They don't sponsor this podcast, but it's like they do because we talk about them all the time. What about performance? Have you run into anything with performance, and have you had to do any optimizations for that?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. The performance issues we've run into is mainly just excessive re-rendering or state kind of living really high up in the React tree and causing a ton of things to re-render needlessly. And it's never been, it's never been like the video layer that's causing issues. It hasn't been any of the native packages that we're pulling in that are causing problems. It's really self-inflicted. We were using Redux for a while, then we moved off of that, and then the team got pretty they thought using React contexts and React providers would be a good pattern to kind of move state into, and that caused a lot of problems. So we're a bit of a cautionary tale with that. So we moved over to a different state management library. We're using one called Jotai to handle our state management, and that's proven to be pretty effective. But, there's so many other packages out there. You can use MobX. I mean, Redux is really good too. So I would really encourage people to use a good state management library.
I love hearing that. As the maintainer of MobX State Tree, I wholeheartedly agree. You don't have to use MST, but use something.
Yeah, exactly. What else in terms of performance? Yeah, let me think about this. One thing that I'm having the team do is keeping the FPS monitor on and using Flipper as often as possible.
Yeah.
By default, those things aren't enabled. So I think for a while, especially in the early days, kind of like 2019, 2020, early 2021, we didn't have very good debugging tools. Flipper came into the scene, I think maybe like a couple of years ago. I don't remember when exactly it launched, but visibility into performance was kind of not at our fingertips. So the team kind of put performance behind us. Unless it was really obvious when using the app, we would just kind of ignore performance. And that's where the excessive re-rendering issues would come in. All the needless state updates would come in. But then as soon as we flipped on the FPS monitor, we would notice, okay, when we click into this screen or do this action, the FPS rate would drop from 60 to 30 or even down to 2 FPS on the JavaScript thread. And we'd be like, what? Why is this happening? And then as soon as we go into Flipper, turn on the flame graph, record, it becomes clear as day what the culprits are. So yeah, that's been really, really helpful.
I love that tip. That is an absolutely great tip to keep on the FPS monitor while you're working, because you're just going to notice things. Going back for a second to your Jotai transition, give me a little bit more insight into the decision that went there and why you chose Jotai. And then also, do you have any regrets? Is that something you would choose again?
Sure. I'll kind of go into the history of our state management in the app. So prior to me joining this team, the decision was made to use Redux and Redux sagas. And that kind of has a pretty clunky API, at least the way it was implemented in this application. So our UI components would dispatch an action that would get picked up by Redux. Sagas was using this pretty complicated generator pattern where you'd have to yield and execute a network request. And back then we were using REST endpoints. We'd execute everything, transform the payload, store it in Redux, and then we'd have map state to props hooked into the specific component to extract that data. It was just a lot of steps to do something pretty basic, which was send a network request, get some data. So we ended up switching over to Apollo and going with the hooks-based approach to pull remote data. And that was so much easier. Our components could just make one call, get the data, render the results. That's it. So we really leaned into that approach, and we didn't have that much extra state to manage. So we were like, well, why do we even need Redux in the first place? So we stripped out Redux, we stripped out Redux sagas, and we went with what React comes with out of the box, which is contexts and providers. And so the team just kind of leaned into that. We would add these contexts and providers to the app root, store a couple of variables in there, and we're like, we know this is kind of a performance hit, but how bad can it really be? Well, it turns out it's pretty bad. We got pretty heavy-handed with that approach, and we noticed the app just started dragging major. The JS thread would dip pretty seriously, even for things that the user wasn't taking action on, like a video recording playing, and we're updating like the progress so we could update some UI. The context provider for that was sitting all the way at the app root and causing everything to re-render, and we just weren't paying attention to that at all. So we were like, okay, this is a problem. We need to switch to something else. And so we took a look at a few different state management libraries, kind of picked Jotai. We liked how clean and simple the API was. For us, we just don't have that much state that we're managing outside of the network requests. So we're like, okay, this kind of looks like a use state hook, and for us, we're kind of only capturing some Booleans, some numbers, some strings. That's kind of it. And yeah, I mean, we've been on Jotai for about 2 months, and we really like it. It's been super simple to work with. I mean, we'll see kind of how things evolve as the app gets more complicated, if we're going to revisit that decision. But right now, everyone on the team loves it. And the performance issues we saw with the contexts are gone. Now that we have, a state management library that you have your one component that triggers an update to that particular Jotai atom. That's the concept that they have. Whatever components are listening directly to that atom get updated, and nothing else re-renders. So that's been fantastic for us.
Yeah, that's amazing. Really interesting to hear how people think through their state management decisions, for sure. Quick question. Have you noticed any cross-platform differences, iOS and Android, while using React Native?
Yes, 100%. So the app is, for the most part, identical on Android and iOS. There's some slight differences with routing and the way, the header renders between Android and iOS. React Navigation just handles that out of the box. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, there are layout differences. Our text renders slightly differently. Line heights are a little bit different. Certain packages render a certain way on iOS, differently on Android. I think we're using a blur view package, which it just doesn't work on Android. So we have to add platform switching logic to not render the blur view in Android. We do in iOS. Other things are, we have different settings, props that we pass in for flat lists, different settings for keyboard avoiding views. They're all just slightly different. So, we don't have any completely different files for each platform. How you can namespace it iOS or Android.
Right. .iOS, .android.
Exactly. Yeah. We're not doing any of that. It's just conditional logic within the components.
Okay.
So it hasn't been too bad, but I've heard the common wisdom that you should be doing Android first development with React Native, because iOS tends to have better support. So, a lot of the devs here, we're Apple fanboys. We like using iOS. So we just tend to build against the iOS simulator and our personal iPhones. And then we neglect Android, and then, we'll ship, UI bugs and all that. So now we're pretty strict about ensuring that with every pull request, you are building against Android and iOS, and you're capturing screen recordings and uploading that to the pull request. We also have a QA team that goes in and tests every single feature against both platforms. Yeah, that's kind of the way we've been doing it.
Yeah, that's always been, because the promise of React Native is being able to, obviously deploy code to both platforms. And so there's always a concern that, there will be some differences, but it's honestly been getting a lot better over the years. What advice would you give to companies that are considering React Native?
I think it depends on the org structure you're trying to build. So, what capabilities does your team already have? I'll go into maybe the rationale of why NTWRK continues to stick with React Native.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, the engineering team is almost completely full stack. We want everyone to ideally be able to hop into any code base and be able to make some kind of contribution. So having our tech stack be as focused as possible really helps with that. We only have to think about our UI in terms of React and JavaScript concepts and our backend in Go, and that's it. If it was every dev had to know about Swift and Kotlin and Go and JavaScript, along with all the frameworks and all the SDKs that are tied up with that, it would be a really tall order to really understand all those ecosystems. So for us, that focus is really beneficial. I think another piece of advice I'd give companies is, the rate of change in the React Native ecosystem is really high. I mean, I think about, the packages we were using and the features we were able to build even 2 years ago is pretty limited compared to what it is now. there's so much going on, so many companies that are in this ecosystem and contributing to open source. Your team really has to stay up to date with what's going on. Just think about the in progress re-architecture of React Native. I think a lot of people aren't even aware of that. I think it's getting publicized now, but back when I started, nobody really knew what was up or what the vision was for React Native. So, for us, I've made it a big deal to like keep up with the releases, figure out what the community is doing and what the best practices are, and tracking that and making sure that the team is educated on those things. I could definitely see a world in which a team might just stagnate and not pay attention to what's developing in the community and not even realize what capabilities they now have.
That's part of what we try to do at Infinite Red, is put out content into the world that real React Native developers actually appreciate and can glean a lot of, high signal, low noise stuff. That's what this podcast is all about. That's what our newsletter, our conference, our community, everything, I live stream sometimes, things like that.
For sure. And honestly, the newsletters and the podcasts that you guys have been putting out have been a huge resource for myself. The React Native subreddit is also quite good. We've been paying attention to that. And then also just all the issues that are coming up and pull requests that are coming up in the React Native core repository. We're paying attention to that, all the change logs, all that. So it's all good information to continuously get exposed to.
That's a good point. I should probably go on the React Native subreddit a little more often than I do, because I'm sure that there's a lot going on there. What advice would you give to new React Native developers?
I think it depends on where you're coming from. You could be a native iOS developer, or a native Android developer, or a web developer. I think the advice I'd give to those different devs are going to be different. But for me, I think the best advice I could give is someone transitioning from web development into React Native. At a top level, read the docs in react.dev, read the docs in reactnative.dev. This is also a bit old, but there's a really good book on TypeScript called Effective TypeScript that I learned a lot from. And then there's another book that a PDF that was actually circulating in the React Native subreddit. It's called The Ultimate Guide to React Native Optimization.
That's from Callstack, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
It's really good. Highly recommend it.
Definitely. As soon as we found that PDF, my team and I found that PDF, we were like, oh man, this is the Bible for building React Native applications. So yeah, highly, highly recommend those resources. I'd say developing on web is a lot easier than mobile. You just have a different set of challenges. For web, you can instantly roll out your application. For the most part, the browsers are all kind of compliant with the same CSS and HTML standards, with the same JavaScript standards. So you don't really have to deal with too many esoteric platform-specific differences. On React Native, you kind of do, although that's changing pretty quickly. I think, what else? There's kind of this jump from understanding HTML concepts like divs and all that to the React Native's concepts of views. I think scrollable elements was also a pretty big jump, conceptual jump from web. So in web, things just kind of scroll by default. In native mobile, they don't. So you have to use flat lists and scroll views and all of that. And then you have to optimize the rendering of the items in those lists. And then, the deployment strategy is completely different, right? On web, you just roll it out, refresh the page. You've got your new React payload. You got your new app. But with iOS and Android, you're beholden to the App Store and the Play Store. And, you have a bunch of terms of service that you have to comply with. One funny story about this app in particular, back when maybe 2 years ago, we didn't have a guest mode in the app. So you had to sign up. You had to make an account to get access to the video content and the products we were selling. That actually violated Apple's terms of service. So they require you, they make a few different cases for it, but for e-commerce apps, you must allow the user to go in and browse your publicly available product catalog without creating an account. So we had this huge in-app event that was taking place, and we got struck with that maybe a few days before this big revenue day for us. And it was a crisis. They were like, you have to implement guest mode. And we're like, oh my gosh. So yeah, you're probably going to hit some roadblocks like that. Yeah, it's a different ballgame for sure.
Did you ship the new feature with the guest mode?
We did. We entered basically like a crisis mode. Basically exposed the most minimum set of screens to comply with Apple's terms. Shipped that, kind of did an expedited review, and we got accepted. Things were good, but it was really kind of last minute changes.
Stressful, yeah.
Incredibly.
Well, thanks, Nick, for joining us today and for kicking off our real life React Native series. This was a lot of fun. It was great to see you again, of course, from Chain React to now, and also to get a chance to pick your brain a little bit about shipping React Native to real users out there. If you'd like to be on this new series and talk about your experience using React Native in the real world, go ahead and email us at rnradio@infinite.red and introduce yourself and your app, and we might have you on. Thanks, everybody, and thanks again, Nick. See you all next time.
Thank you.